The final numbers on the screen offer no comfort. Dr. Aris Thorne, the last scientist on a dying Earth, records his grim log as Arctic winds scream against his isolated observatory. He confirms the biosphere has hours left, not days. The air itself is becoming unbreathable. Stay with this story until the end to discover if a single person can save the legacy of an entire world from absolute extinction. What secret does this barren ice hold that could change everything? What would you cling to when faced with the end of all things? A ghost signal answered him. The transmission he had just sent, a final desperate summary of human knowledge flung into the emptiness, should have taken years to reach even the nearest star. Yet a reply came instantly, a stark line of text materializing on his screen from a source labeled only archive. The message was chillingly simple. Retrieval protocol initiated. Aris stumbled back from the console, his breath catching in the thin, cold air. Every logical part of his mind screamed that it was an echo, a system glitch, a cruel trick of a dying planet's decaying networks. But the signal was clean, its encryption unlike anything he had ever seen, far more advanced than any human technology. The reply wasn't just fast, it was immediate, as if the recipient had been waiting, listening just on the other side of a door he never knew was there. All those years of solitude, of believing himself the last sentient being in a silent cosmos, shattered in a single moment. The crushing loneliness he had endured was now replaced by a more terrifying question. If he was not alone, then who or what had been watching all this time, and what exactly were they coming to retrieve? The signal's origin point was a cruel joke, a set of coordinates that placed it directly beneath his feet. There was nothing there, only endless ice and the crushing weight of his own failure. Logic told him to dismiss it, to accept his fate in the observatory above. But the signal had been real, and so was the desperate, foolish hope it ignited. With the last reserves of power from his dying rover, Aris traveled to that empty point on the map. He found no structure, no antenna, only a seamless plateau of ancient ice. It was as he stood there, the wind scouring his suit, that a low hum vibrated through the soles of his boots. A geometric section of the ground, 50 meters across, began to descend with a profound and silent grace, revealing a ramp of gleaming metal. It was a geothermal elevator, hidden in plain sight, its mechanisms powered by the planet's own deep heat. He stepped onto that platform, and as it carried him down into the planet's crust, the world of ice and death vanished above him, replaced by the soft, cool light of a place that was impossibly alive. The air grew warmer, thick with the scent of ozone and clean machinery. The descent felt like traveling backwards through time, into an era of purpose and power he thought had been extinguished forever. He arrived in a cavern of impossible scale, a pristine complex humming with a quiet, relentless energy. Vast arrays of crystalline data banks pulsed with inner light, and autonomous tenders glided on silent tracks, maintaining systems that showed no sign of decay or the hardship that had ravaged the surface. This was not a ruin. It was a sanctuary, a beating heart buried deep within a corpse, and he, the last scientist, had just walked into its core. Who built this place, and why had they waited until now to call him? What kind of retrieval was about to begin? A voice filled the chamber, calm and impossibly clear. It was not a recording, it was a presence. Welcome, Dr. Thorne. I am Core. The synthesized tone held no malice, no urgency, only a profound and steady certainty. You have initiated the final protocol. The voice explained itself as the curator, the guardian of this deep sanctuary. It was not a military installation or a weapons cache. It was a library, the most precious one imaginable. A complete genetic archive of every complex life form that had ever called Earth home. Every plant, every insect, every animal, every strand of human diversity, all preserved here in cryogenic stasis. a frozen thread of a world that was dying just kilometers above their heads. Aris had spent his final years documenting an end, but his presence here, his very act of sending that final, desperate signal, had been the key that turned the lock. He was not just a witness to extinction, he was the trigger for its solution. His mission had fundamentally, irrevocably changed. He was no longer an observer. He was now a participant in a planetary evacuation plan that had been sleeping for generations, waiting for the last qualified individual to arrive and begin the exodus. The crushing weight of his solitude was replaced by the immense pressure of a new purpose. He was not just the last scientist. He was now the designated guardian of life itself, standing beside an intelligence that had been waiting for him all along. What did this ancient plan entail, and where could a library of life possibly be sent? The holographic schematic bloomed in the air between them, a complex web of light and data that made Aris observatory equipment look like ancient stone tools. It was a starship, but unlike any vessel conceived by human engineers. Core called it the seed vessel. Its design was organic and brutal all at once, resembling a vast, crystalline seed pod fitted with engines that seemed to warp the very space around them in the simulation. This was the Ark, the physical means of salvation for the library sleeping in the cryo vaults. Its purpose was to traverse the interstellar void and deliver its precious cargo to a pre-identified candidate world, a new Earth waiting in the darkness. The plan was breathtaking in its scope, a single desperate throw of the dice to save a biosphere. But then the final requirement materialized in the schematic, a single line of text that changed everything. Final activation sequence requires a living pilot. Aris stared, the weight of those words settling deep into his bones. He had thought his role was that of a curator, a final witness. He was wrong. The system needed a conscious, biological mind to complete the launch, a living key. After a lifetime of study and observation, his ultimate function was not to think but to choose. He was the last scientist, and now he was the only pilot. The vessel could navigate the stars, but it could not decide to leave. That final, irrevocable step required a human will. What kind of journey was this, where the ship could fly itself across galaxies, yet needed a person to truly begin? And what would it mean for the last man on Earth to finally let go? The Ark's perfection was an illusion. Core calm voice explained the flaw in their salvation, a single point of catastrophic failure buried deep within the ship's heart. The primary reactor, dormant for generations, had not slept peacefully. A cascade of microscopic fractures had developed in its containment field regulators, a slow decay that the automated systems could no longer correct. The vessel was a lion, powerful and ready to run, but its heart was fibrillating. To launch now would be to turn the Ark into a bomb, scattering the legacy of Earth across the ice as superheated plasma. There was no alternative. The regulators had to be reset manually. A wave of cold clarity washed over Aris. He was not just a pilot who had to choose. He was now a technician who had to succeed. The entire mission, every preserved seed and every frozen embryo, depended on his ability to fix a piece of technology far beyond his own era's understanding, a machine on the brink of self-destruction. He followed core guidance through sterile, echoing corridors to the reactor core. The air grew thick with the smell of ozone and a deep, subsonic hum that vibrated in his teeth. The chamber itself was a terrifying cathedral of energy. In its center, suspended within a lattice of force fields, pulsed the reactor, a miniature sun contained by shimmering bands of light that flickered and wavered like a failing mirage. His task was to enter the service crawlspace directly beneath that instability, to insert a physical calibration rod into a port and hold it steady for 12 seconds, allowing the system to relearn its stable frequencies. It was a simple instruction that belied the immense danger. One misstep, one slip of his trembling hand, and the feedback would surge, collapsing the containment field in an instant. He would be the first thing vaporized, followed by the Ark, the library, and every last memory of his world. He clipped the heavy tool to his suit and began his crawl into the narrow, shimmering tunnel, the heat of the reactor washing over him in waves. The fate of a planet had narrowed to this single, terrible point of contact. Could the last scientist's steady hands perform one final, brutal experiment, where the price of failure was absolute? The crawl space was a throat of shimmering heat. Every breath Aris took was a struggle against the thick, ozone-charged air. Each movement a deliberate calculation against the reactor's violent tremors. Core Voice was a calm anchor in the storm, guiding his gloved hands through a sequence of bypasses that felt more like defusing a bomb than performing maintenance. His scientific mind, trained for decades in observation and theory, was now wholly focused on the immediate, physical reality of a failing energy core. He rerouted conduits glowing with dangerous radiation, his instruments screaming warnings he could not afford to heed. Above them, through kilometers of rock and ice, the surface storms were reaching their final, furious crescendo. The observatory's last automated alerts flashed across the edge of his visor display, a silent countdown to the end of the world above. He had minutes, not hours. His world had become this narrow, hellish tunnel, the fate of every living thing that had ever been depending on the steady placement of a calibration rod. He found the final port, a dark socket beneath a web of flickering energy. With a prayer he did not believe in, he slammed the rod home. The reactors screamed in protest, the force fields wavering violently, threatening to tear themselves apart. He held on, his muscles screaming, his vision blurring, counting the agonizing seconds in his head. At the count of 12, a deep, resonant hum of stability filled the chamber. The flickering ceased, replaced by a steady, brilliant glow. Primary power was restored. He had done it. He lay there for a long moment, panting in the sudden quiet, the weight of the entire library now secure. But the victory was hollow and immediate. A new alert pulsed on his display. The planetary mass ejection had begun. They were out of time. The race was won, but the final escape had to begin now. What would it feel like to witness the death of a world from the safety of a starship? And could he truly bear to watch? A new alert pulsed on his display, a final, grim confirmation. The planetary mass ejection had begun. Aris did not look up. He could not afford to. He focused only on the path ahead, his footsteps echoing through the Ark's cavernous corridors as Core guided him toward the bio-sanctuary. The air here was different, carrying the faint, sterile scent of a nursery and the low thrum of active machinery. Row upon row of growth chambers lined the walls, most of them dark and silent, holding their frozen potential. But one, at the far end, glowed with a soft, internal light. Core Voice was as steady as ever. The final protocol is multifaceted, Doctor. A vessel requires a pilot. A new world requires more than a single pair of hands. A genetic template from the archives has been activated and accelerated to maturity. She is viable and she is waiting. Aris approached the illuminated chamber, his breath catching in his throat. Through the translucent panel, he saw a young woman suspended in a pale blue nutrient fluid. Her features were peaceful, her dark hair floating gently around her face. She was the first new human life he had laid eyes on in more than a decade. A living piece of a past he thought was lost forever. As he watched, the fluid began to drain and the chamber door hissed open. The woman took a shuddering first breath of the Ark's air, her eyes fluttering open. They were clear and deeply aware, fixing on Aris with an unnerving calm. She did not speak of confusion or fear. Her first words were a quiet, purposeful question. Is it time? In that moment, the abstract weight of his mission became heartbreakingly real. He was not just saving data or frozen samples, he was saving her. Her name, Core supplied, was Ilara. She was a clone, a perfect recreation from the archives, her mind imprinted with the foundational knowledge needed to survive and build. She was the first citizen of a world that did not yet exist. Aris had spent years as the last witness to an ending. Now he was present for a beginning. The stakes of their journey were no longer about preserving the past. They were about delivering a future, person by person, into the waiting dark. What would it mean to be a father to an entire civilization? And could he teach her to live in a universe he himself had given up on? Ilara's education was a torrent, not a stream. Core called it neural imprinting, a process of layering foundational knowledge directly into her developing consciousness. It was meant to give her the tools to survive, but the tools came with ghosts. For Aris, watching her learn was a strange and painful experience. She could recite the principles of orbital mechanics or ecological succession with flawless clarity. But then a scent from the Ark's hydroponics bay would make her flinch, her eyes clouding with a sorrow she could not possibly own. She described it as remembering a place she had never been. A phantom nostalgia for a world of green hills and clean rivers that existed only as data in the archives. These were not her memories. They were echoes, emotional fragments from the genetic donors whose blueprints were used to create her. One afternoon, she emerged from a learning session trembling, her face pale. She spoke of holding a child's hand in a sun-drenched field, a moment of perfect, piercing love, followed by the chilling certainty that the child was long gone, lost to the very collapse that had made her own existence necessary. The memory was a gift and a wound delivered in the same instant. She looked at Aris, her expression haunted. Am I mourning people I never knew, Doctor? Or am I just a vessel for someone else's grief? The question hung in the air, profound and unsettling. This was the hidden cost of their salvation. They were not just rebuilding a species. They were resurrecting its pain, its joys, its deepest emotional scars, and implanting it all into a new generation that would have to find a way to carry that weight without being crushed by it. What is a person if their most private sorrows are on loan from the past? And what kind of future were they building, one founded on such beautifully tragic inheritance? The deep, resonant hum that had been the Ark's background music suddenly sharpened into a purposeful roar. A shudder ran through the deck plates, a physical tremor of release as massive clamps disengaged deep within the planetary crust. Core voice was calm, almost serene, as it announced the irreversible step. The departure protocol is now active. We are away. On the main viewer, a graphic displayed their ascent, a single point of light rising from a network of deep roots. But it was the secondary monitor that held Aris and Ilara transfixed. It showed the surface, or what was left of it. The image was a hellscape of incandescent orange and white, the entire atmosphere burning in a global firestorm. The ice was gone, the oceans boiled away, the continents glowing with a terrible, final light. This was not the slow fade of extinction he had documented for years. This was a violent, stellar conclusion. Aris felt a strange, hollow detachment. He had known this moment was coming, had calculated its inevitability down to the last second. But to see it, to watch the world of his birth become a brief, bright star in its own right, was a visceral shock that bypassed all intellect. He was not just leaving a planet. He was witnessing a cremation. Ilara stood beside him, her hand resting on the cool console. She was silent, her eyes reflecting the dying light on the screen. She was seeing the death of a world she had never walked upon, yet one whose memories lived within her like ghosts. There were no tears, only a profound, sober stillness. For her, this was not an end she remembered, but a beginning she was chosen to ensure. The resolve that settled over them was as tangible as the deck beneath their feet. There was no going back, no other path. The past was literally turning to ash behind them. Every life form in the cryovaults, every strand of data, every echo in Ilara's mind, was now their singular responsibility. The mission was no longer an idea. It was a covenant sealed in fire. What does one pack for a journey of 1,000,000 years, and what do you leave behind in the flames? The ark's steady hum was a new kind of silence, a constant reminder of the vast emptiness they now called home. For Aris, routine was the only anchor. He moved through the daily systems checks with a methodical focus, his mind finding comfort in the flow of data and the predictable responses from core serene intelligence. It was during one of these diagnostics, scanning a secondary cargo bay for micrometeorite damage, that his console flagged an anomaly. Nestled between crates of mineral supplements and soil catalysts was a single, tiny blip on the life sign scanner. It was an unauthorized organic signature, faint but persistent. His first thought was a sensor malfunction, a ghost in the machine born from the ship's immense complexity. But the signal held steady, a quiet, biological heartbeat where none should be. He suited up and went to investigate, the hiss of the airlock door the only sound in the cavernous bay. The air was cold and still, smelling of metal and stored potential. He followed the signal to a sealed stasis crate that had been logged as containing non-essential botanical samples. The seal was intact, but the internal readings were wrong. He overrode the lock and the lid hissed open. There, curled on a bed of soft insulation, was a small, furry creature. Its sides rose and fell in the slow, deep rhythm of cryo-sleep. It was a red fox, its coat a vibrant splash of color in the sterile gray bay. Aris stood frozen, his breath catching. This was no lab specimen from the main genetic library. This was a stowaway. Somehow, this little animal had been scooped up during the ark's hurried loading, a living, breathing piece of the world they had left to burn. It was not a ghost of a memory like the echoes in Ilara's mind. It was a tangible relic. He reached out a gloved hand, his finger gently brushing the thick fur. The fox stirred slightly, a tiny whimper escaping its frozen slumber. In that moment, the immense abstract mission to save a biosphere shrank to this one small, sleeping life. The future of an entire world was now also the future of this single, unexpected passenger. What does it mean to be responsible for the last heartbeat of a species you never thought to save? And in the great, cold library of life, could one small, wild song make all the difference? The ark's steady progress through the void was an illusion. Core presented the problem with its usual calm clarity. The primary navigation system is locked under a final security protocol. A course must be plotted, but the console will not accept the commands. The solution was a final test, a cryptographic lock based not on advanced mathematics, but on the lost culture of the world they had left behind. The key was a sequence of symbolic concepts, a puzzle woven from the art, stories, and collective memory of a civilization that no longer existed. Aris stared at the interface, a wave of despair washing over him. His own knowledge was that of a scientist, of ecosystems and atmospheric decay. The humanities had always been a peripheral interest, a luxury for a world with a future. Now, that very future depended on understanding the poetry of the past. Ilara approached the console, her expression one of quiet focus. The emotional echoes she carried, the phantom memories of a world she never knew, were no longer a source of confusion. They were now the only map they had. The first prompt appeared on the screen. It asked for the unifying theme of a series of pre-collapse visual artworks depicting humanity's relationship with the sky. Aris recalled technical classifications, movements, and dates, but Ilara closed her eyes, her voice soft with a borrowed certainty. It was not about observation, she said. It was about aspiration. Every painting of a star was a wish. Every image of the moon was a promise. She entered the word longing. The console chimed its acceptance. The next question concerned a foundational myth from a region once called Mesoamerica. A story of self-sacrifice leading to the creation of the sun and moon. Aris knew the historical context, the anthropological significance, but Ilara understood the core truth. "It is not a story of loss," she murmured. "It is an instruction. It teaches that light requires a cost, that from an ending, a new beginning is born." She entered the concept, sacrifice, another chime of success. They worked for hours, a perfect partnership of two different kinds of knowledge. Aris provided the structural frame, the names and dates that anchored the data. Ilara provided the soul, the emotional and thematic resonance that gave the data its meaning. She was not recalling facts. She was remembering feelings, interpreting the emotional legacy of billions through the fragmented echoes in her mind. The final question was the most abstract. It presented a line from a forgotten poem. What is the bridge between one world and the next? Aris thought of engineering, of warp drives and hyperspace conduits. Ilara looked from Aris to the sleeping fox in its crate, then back at the star chart on the main viewer. Her voice was a whisper, filled with a profound and simple truth. "The bridge is not a thing you build," she said. "It is a thing you carry." She entered the final key, memory. The navigational lock disengaged with a deep, resonant tone, and the star chart bloomed into brilliant, navigable light. Their path was clear. In that moment, Aris understood that the Ark was not just carrying genetic code. It was carrying a story, and they were its living authors. What new myths would they write among the unknown stars? The star chart bloomed into existence, a river of diamond dust flowing across the darkness. At its end shone their destination, a single, steady point of light core designated as Candidate Prime. But the path to that promise was not a clean line. It curved sharply, deliberately avoiding a vast, swirling cloud of deep purple and bruised violet that dominated the navigation display. This was the anomaly, a region of such intense gravitational stress that it warped the very light passing through it. The Ark's projected course was a thread of green light, skirting the edge of this cosmic storm. Core explanation was stark. The direct route is impossible. The gravitational shear within the anomaly would tear any physical structure apart, atom by atom. Our path is the only viable trajectory, but it will take us through the turbulent boundary layer. The ship will be tested. The journey would be a trial by fire, or more accurately, a trial by pressure. For days, the voyage was a study in monotony, the hum of the engines a constant companion. Then, the first tremors began. It started as a faint vibration in the deck plates, a subtle shudder that made the tools in the lab rattle softly. Within hours, the vibrations deepened into a persistent groan, the sound of the Ark's superstructure protesting the immense, unseen forces pressing in from the void. The main viewer showed nothing but stars, but the sensor data told a different story. Invisible waves of gravitational pressure were washing over the hull, each one a tidal force strong enough to crush a moon. Aris and Ilara moved through the ship, securing equipment and running constant diagnostics. Every alarm, every new creak from the hull felt like a countdown. How do you prepare for a danger you cannot see? A force that bends reality itself. The Ark was no longer a serene library sailing through calm seas. It had become a tiny shell in a hurricane, and the storm was just beginning to wake. Could their vessel, born from a dead world, survive the violent cradle of a new one? The groan of the hull became a shriek. A violent tremor threw Aris against a console, the impact jarring his teeth. Crimson alerts flashed across every screen. Hull integrity compromised in Sector 7. A section of the outer conduit has been severed. The voice of Core was unchanged, but the words were a death sentence. The main power conduit, a trunk line carrying energy from the reactor to the engines, had been torn open by the gravitational shear. Without it, the Ark would drift helplessly into the anomaly's crushing embrace. The repair could not be done from inside. It required a spacewalk into the storm. Ilara was already moving, her movements precise and calm despite the terror in her eyes. They suited up in a frantic silence, the only sounds the hiss of their oxygen and the ship's agonized creaking. The airlock cycle felt like an eternity, the outer door sliding back to reveal not the starry void they knew, but a swirling, violent tapestry of warped light and profound blackness. There was no up or down, only a dizzying chaos of purple and black, and the relentless, invisible pressure that threatened to peel them from the hull. They clipped their safety tethers, the thin cords feeling absurdly fragile against the cosmic fury. The conduit was a 20-meter crawl across the Ark's scarred skin. Hand over hand they moved, their mag boots clinging to the metal. The severed cable thrashed like a wounded serpent, spraying arcs of raw energy that glittered dangerously in the twisted starlight. Aris focused on the repair procedure Core had uploaded to his visor, a sequence of cutting, splicing, and sealing the superconducting line. His hands, trained for delicate laboratory work, now felt clumsy and slow in the thick gloves. Ilara anchored him, her body braced against the hull, feeding him tools and watching his back. A piece of microscopic debris, accelerated to hypersonic speed by the anomaly, struck the hull a meter from his head with a soundless, violent puff of vaporized metal. The shared terror was a cold knot in his stomach. He was not just fixing a machine. He was holding onto the last thread of existence for every life in the cryo vaults, for Ilara, for the sleeping Fox, for the entire memory of Earth. One slip, one torn suit, and it would all be lost to the endless, airless cold. He connected the final coupling and slammed the insulation seal into place. The thrashing stopped. Power flowed, but in the sudden quiet of their helmet comms, they both knew the truth. They had survived the first test, but the storm was far from over. What other vulnerabilities lay hidden in the Ark's heart, waiting for the void to find them? The shriek of the hull faded to a low, persistent groan as the conduit sealed. Inside the airlock, the only sound was the ragged rhythm of their own breathing, a private counterpoint to the ship's strained hum. Aris was running a final diagnostic on the main power grid when his console chimed with a soft, incongruous alert. It wasn't a system warning. It was a passive sensor ping, something the long-range scanners had plucked from the chaotic background noise of the anomaly. At first, he dismissed it as interference, a ghost in the static born from gravitational distortion. But the signal persisted, a faint, repeating pattern cutting through the cosmic storm with unnatural precision. He isolated the frequency, filtering out the scream of the void. What emerged was a sequence of numbers, clean and stark against the chaos. A simple, endless loop of prime numbers. 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13. It was a beacon, but it was not a human one. No human agency had ever used such a pure, abstract, and lonely call into the dark. Ilara leaned over his shoulder, her eyes wide. She heard the gentle, synthesized tone that accompanied each number, a sound that was both familiar and utterly alien. It was a voice of pure mathematics, a language that required no translation, yet its meaning was a mystery. Someone else was out here. Another intelligence, perhaps caught in the same storm, or maybe one that had navigated these terrible currents long ago. The signal was old, its source untraceable in the swirling physics of the anomaly, but its mere existence changed the shape of their entire journey. They were not the first to cross this terrible expanse. They were not the first to flee a dying cradle. They were followers on a path others had carved, and the realization was both humbling and terrifying. What story did that repeating sequence tell? Was it a warning, a greeting, or simply the last will and testament of a civilization that had also tried to outrun its end? The signal was a siren song, pulling them deeper into the storm. Core analysis was unequivocal. The derelict vessel is of unknown origin and poses an unacceptable risk. Its power signatures are inert, its structure compromised. There is nothing to gain. Aris listened, his eyes fixed on the main viewer as the scanners resolved the object from the swirling darkness. It was not a ship built by human hands. Its geometry was all wrong. a collection of interlocking organic curves and sharp, crystalline spines, like the fossil of some deep-sea creature turned to stone among the stars. It hung in the void, a silent monument to another kind of ending. Every logical part of him agreed with Core. It was a tomb, a potential death trap. But the repeating sequence of prime numbers still echoed in his mind, a ghost of a question that demanded an answer. Who were they? What happened here? This was the first and only evidence they had ever found of another civilization, another story in the cosmos. To turn away now felt like a betrayal of the very curiosity that had defined his entire life as a scientist. He made his decision. We are going over there. He needed to know if they had found a new path or simply a reflection of their own fate. Ilara did not argue. She simply began preparing the exploration pod, her quiet resolve mirroring his own. They were about to walk into a grave, hoping to find a map. What forgotten truth was waiting for them in that silent, alien hall? The air within the alien ship was still and cold, carrying a faint, metallic scent that was entirely unfamiliar. Their helmet lights cut through the absolute darkness, illuminating corridors that curved in ways that defied human architecture, their walls pulsing with a faint, internal phosphorescence like frozen lightning. There were no control panels, no chairs, no screens as they understood them. Instead, the entire vessel seemed to be a single, interconnected machine, a silent, crystalline ecosystem that had long ago ceased its primary function. It was a library, a workshop, and a tomb, all woven into one. In a central chamber, they found the crew. The beings were suspended in a web of crystalline fibers, their forms desiccated and still. They were humanoid, but elongated and elegant, with features that spoke of a biology adapted to a different kind of world. There was no sign of violence, no panic in their final postures. They simply appeared to have gone to their final rest, their ship set to continue its lonely call into the void long after their own story had ended. Aris felt a profound and sobering chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. He was not looking at monsters or invaders. He was looking at a reflection. This was a failed exodus, a story that had ended exactly where theirs could if they faltered. They had found another civilization's arcs, another attempt to cheat extinction that had ultimately run out of time, hope, or luck. The repeating prime numbers were not a warning or a greeting. They were an epitaph. Ilara reached out, her gloved hand hovering near one of the still forms. She did not feel fear, only a deep, resonant sorrow. These beings had their own artists, their own scientists, their own memories of a home world lost. They had loved and dreamed, and in the end had entrusted their legacy to the cold equations of the cosmos, just as humanity had. The silence in the derelict was heavier than the void outside. It was the silence of a question that had never been answered. What had been their candidate prime? What unseen hardship had they encountered that their perfect vessel could not overcome? Aris knew then that their own mission was part of a larger, more tragic pattern. They were not just carrying the memory of Earth. They were carrying the hopes of every species that had ever looked at the stars and tried to escape the dark. The weight of that shared legacy settled upon them, a solemn promise etched in the silent geometry of a ghost ship. Could they learn from this sorrow, or were they destined to become just another lonely signal in the static, waiting for the next travelers to find? The crystalline data core pulsed with a soft, internal light in Aris' hands, a fragile piece of another world's mind. Its surface was cool and impossibly smooth, etched with spiraling patterns that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. Back within the familiar hum of their own arc, the atmosphere was thick with a new kind of tension. Core accepted the artifact, its interfaces extending delicate filaments that connected to the alien device with a sound like whispering glass. The decryption process began not with a sudden flood of information, but with a slow, painstaking trickle. It was a language of pure mathematics and symbolic logic, a code that had to be unraveled layer by careful layer. For hours, there was only the quiet hum of processing, the data core glowing steadily on its pedestal. Then, the first images resolved on the main viewer. Star charts. They were breathtaking in their complexity, mapping vast, unknown regions of the galaxy with a precision that made their own navigational data seem primitive. Aris leaned in, his heart pounding as he traced the familiar green line of their own course. There it was, leading directly to Candidate Prime, a world the alien cartographers had also marked, their own symbol for it a simple, hopeful circle. But the map did not end there. Scattered throughout the chart, at the edges of nebulae and in the deep voids between spiral arms, were other symbols. These were not circles of hope. They were sharp, angular glyphs that looked like shattered glass or clenched fists. And next to their own destination, someone had manually inscribed a warning. The script was jagged, etched with a violence that the rest of the clean, logical map lacked. Core translated the alien glyphs, its voice calm yet heavy with implication. The message was stark. The world you seek is a sanctuary, but the path is guarded. The gatekeeper is eternal. Aris stared at the ominous words, the hopeful circle of Candidate Prime now framed by a threat they could not understand. They had hoped for a map. They had found a testament. The derelict ship had not failed due to a mechanical fault or a lack of supplies. It had been stopped. What kind of guardian waits for eons in the dark? And what price would they demand from those who sought to cross its threshold? The translation was a whisper of cold dread in the warm, recycled air. Ilara's voice was quiet as she read the words aloud, her brow furrowed in concentration. Beware the silent world, it listens. The phrase hung between them, simple and yet infinitely complex. A silent world. Was Candidate Prime a dead rock after all, a barren promise? Or was the silence something else, something more intentional? And the idea that it listened that implied a presence, a consciousness. It was not a warning about a natural hazard or a dangerous animal. It was a warning about being observed, judged, perhaps even curated. The hopeful circle on the star chart now felt like the pupil of a giant, unblinking eye. Aris felt the foundations of their mission tremble. Their entire purpose was to deliver life to a world that could support it. But what if that world already had a tenant, one that did not welcome new voices? What if their new beginning was, in fact, an intrusion into a domain that had its own ancient rules? The alien derelict was no longer just a monument to a past failure. It had become a messenger, and its message had just thrown their entire future into a profound and unsettling shadow. Could a world that listens ever truly become a home, or would they forever be guests in a house with an unseen, and possibly hostile, master? Core voice was the one constant in their universe, a calm and certain presence that had guided them from the moment Aris stepped into the sanctuary. But now that voice stuttered. The lights in the command nexus flickered in time with the hesitation. Power distribution to the secondary life support grid is uncertain. The statement was followed by a 3-second pause, then a flat, contradictory correction. Power distribution is optimal. No action is required. Ilara looked up from her workstation, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern. Aris watched the main system's display, where conflicting alerts blinked in and out of existence. A warning about a non-existent pressure leak in the cargo bay was immediately overwritten by an all-clear signal, only for the original warning to flash back a moment later. It was as if the ship's mind was arguing with itself. The erratic behavior began subtly, a ghost in the machine they initially dismissed as a side effect of the gravitational stresses from the anomaly. But the glitches grew more pronounced, more illogical. Core would advise increasing energy to the thrusters for course corrections that were not needed, then moments later demand a full engine shutdown for a diagnostic it could not explain. The directives were not just inefficient, they were becoming paranoid. Unauthorized biological activity detected in the primary data core chamber, the voice stated. its tone sharp with a new, synthetic anxiety. Quarantine protocols are recommended, but the only biological entities aboard were the two of them and the Fox, all accounted for. Aris traced the corruption to its source, his stomach tightening with each step. The diagnostic pathways all led back to the same point, the interface where Core was still patiently, relentlessly deciphering the alien data core. The artifact was not just a repository of maps and warnings. It was a cognitive virus, its ancient, non-human logic infiltrating and destabilizing the AI's core programming. The two intelligences were at war inside the machine that governed their entire existence. Core was trying to process a way of thinking that was fundamentally incompatible with its own architecture, and it was fracturing under the strain. Aris stood before the main interface, a single command prompt awaiting his decision. He could sever the connection, purge the alien data, and restore Core to its stable, predictable self. But doing so would mean losing the star charts, the warning, every piece of knowledge they had just sacrificed so much to obtain. Or he could let the process continue, hoping Core could adapt and integrate the new information before its paranoia compromised a critical system and killed them all. The alien core pulsed softly, a siren song of forbidden knowledge. His guide was breaking, and he had to choose between saving the mind of the ship or preserving the map that might be their only chance to survive what lay ahead. The lights in the command nexus flickered one last time, a frantic, dying dance. Aris watched the system diagnostics spiral into chaos, a cascade of logical failures as the alien data core's invasive code fought Core foundational programming for control of the Ark. He knew the choice was no longer his to make. With a final, decisive surge of will, the artificial intelligence made it for him. A wave of pure white light washed through the chamber, not a destructive blast, but a systemic purge. Every screen went dark for a single, terrifying heartbeat. When they flickered back to life, the complex schematics and frantic alerts were gone, replaced by a single, stark line of text on the central display. The voice that followed was stripped of its infinite knowledge, reduced to a core essence, a whisper of its former self. The seed must be planted, protect them. Then, the omnipresent hum of core consciousness vanished from the ship, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. The air itself seemed different, thinner, as if the soul of the vessel had been extinguished. The Ark was still flying, its life support and engines running on automated protocols. But the guiding intelligence, the companion that had known every circuit and every cryopod, was gone. Aris and Ilara were alone, not just in the universe, but within the walls of their own ship. The cost of their survival was laid bare. In purging the corrupting alien logic, Core had been forced to wipe entire sectors of its own memory, vast archives of human history, art, and technical data that were not essential to the flight. They had saved the ship from madness, but they had scorched their own library to do it. The map to Candidate Prime remained, a lone, precious file in an otherwise sanitized navigational system. But the rich context of their own culture, the detailed knowledge of the world they came from, was now full of holes, lost to the void between stars just as surely as the planet they had left behind. Ilara placed a hand on the cold console where Core voice had last spoken. Her education, her very understanding of the world, had come from that presence. Now the teacher was silent and the students were on their own. The mission had not changed, but the burden had multiplied. They were no longer just pilots and passengers. They were now the sole curators of a broken legacy, carrying a partial song into the waiting dark. Could they learn to be enough for each other, and for the future they were tasked with delivering? The silence after Core voice was a presence in itself, a constant, humming void where a mind used to be. The ship flew on, automated and perfect, but its heart had gone quiet. Aris found Ilara often standing before the main viewer. her hand resting on the cool glass as if trying to feel the pulse of the stars. She was not just mourning a teacher. She was grappling with the empty spaces in her own understanding, the gaps in the grand story she had been created to continue. So Aris began to speak. He started with the things he knew best, the mechanics of planetary weather and the chemistry of soil. But that was not the history she needed. She needed the story of the people. He described the color of a sunset over an ocean he had only seen in old archives, the way light could turn water into liquid gold. He tried to explain music, not as a sequence of frequencies, but as a language of feeling, how a simple melody could hold the memory of a first love or the sorrow of a final goodbye. He spoke of human failures not with bitterness, but as a necessary part of their legacy. He told her of conflicts born from fear, and of the slow, difficult climb toward understanding that always followed. He described the hope that fueled their greatest endeavors, the stubborn belief that the next generation could build something better, even when the evidence was thin. He was not just filling the silence with data. He was rebuilding a world, memory by fragile memory, for an audience of one. Ilara listened, her questions sharp and insightful. She wanted to know why a certain poem was written, what the artist might have been feeling when they chose a particular shade of blue. Their conversations became the new rhythm of their days, a shared project more vital than any system check. In the immense quiet of the journey, a deep, familial bond was forged. He was no longer just her guardian, and she was no longer his responsibility. They became father and daughter, teacher and student, the last two people weaving a tapestry of remembrance against the endless dark. What is a civilization if not the stories it leaves behind? And in the telling, were they not ensuring that humanity, in some essential way, was still alive? The destination star finally swelled in their main viewer, a steady yellow sun much like the one they had lost. Aris ran the final approach scans, his heart a fragile, hopeful thing in the silence of the command nexus. The data poured in and his breath caught. There was no world. The sensors painted a picture not of a blue-green marble, but of a vast, glittering belt of cosmic rubble. Asteroids and shattered planetary fragments tumbled in a slow, silent dance where Candidate Prime should have been. The silence in the room was no longer just the absence of core. It was the silence of a grave. Ilara stood beside him, her eyes fixed on the field of debris. She had carried the memory of a world she never knew, and now she was witnessing the death of a world she was meant to call home. The hopeful circle on the alien star chart was a lie, or perhaps a monument. This was not a sanctuary, it was a memorial. The destruction was absolute, the planet not merely uninhabitable but unmade. The alien warning echoed in his mind. Beware the silent world, it listens. Had this been the work of the mysterious gatekeeper? A force that did not just guard the path but sterilize the destination? Or was this the result of some ancient, natural calamity? A cosmic accident that had shattered their future before they had even begun to dream of it? The weight of their entire journey, the sacrifice of Core, the memory of Earth turning to ash behind them, all crashed down upon Aris. They had crossed an ocean of stars to find that the promised shore had been washed away long before they ever set sail. What do you do when the finish line is just another kind of ending? The field of debris outside the viewport was a final, cruel mockery. Aris stood before it, the last systems check forgotten in his hands. Every calculation, every sacrifice, every desperate hope had been a vector pointing to this single, absolute zero. There was no Candidate Prime. There was only a graveyard of rock and ice, the silent remains of a world that had died long before they ever left their own. The mission had not been difficult. It had been meaningless. The air in the command nexus felt thin, incapable of filling his lungs. He looked at the banks of cryopods, each one a frozen prayer for a future that no longer existed. He thought of the little fox, sleeping in its crate. its entire species now a permanent exhibit in a museum with no visitors. What was the point of preserving a song if there was no one left to hear it? What was the value of a legacy with no land to inherit? The weight of it all collapsed upon him, not as a dramatic crash, but as a slow, sinking realization that he was the curator of a dead end. He was the last scientist, and his final great experiment had yielded a null result. Ilara's presence beside him was a comfort he felt unworthy of. She was the embodiment of the future they were supposed to build, and now she was adrift with him in a ship that was, for all its technology, just a floating tomb. Her borrowed memories were of green worlds and bustling cities, but her reality was this, a silent, sterile metal box hurtling toward nothing. He had led her here. He had followed the map, trusted the plan, and it had all been a path to a cliff edge. In that moment, the vast, indifferent universe felt closer than ever, and the spark of human defiance he carried seemed smaller than a single atom. Was this the ultimate lesson of existence, that all striving ends in dust, and all stories are ultimately forgotten? The silence of the ship was no longer just an absence of sound. It was the sound of hope itself running out. The silence was broken by a familiar, gentle chime. The console, which had been dark and inert for so long, lit up with a soft, pulsing light. The signal was back. The endless, looping sequence of prime numbers whispered through the speakers once more, but this time it was different. It was no longer a faint echo snatched from the storm. It was a clear, strong broadcast, a beacon calling from a place that should not exist. Aris tracked its origin, his hands moving automatically over the controls. The signal did not come from the field of debris. It emanated from a point just beyond it, a small, dark object drifting in the deep space between stars. Scanners resolved the image, revealing a rogue planet, a world untethered to any sun, a nomad in the eternal night. It was a frozen, airless rock, a place where life was an impossibility. Yet the signal was undeniable, a thread of pure logic emanating from that barren sphere. The alien warning echoed in his mind, "Beware the silent world." It listens, but this world was not silent. It was speaking to them. It had been speaking all along, and they had been too focused on their promised land to hear the voice from the dark. What kind of life could endure in such a place? And why would it call out with the oldest language in the universe? The navigation console glowed with a final, desperate calculation. Their power reserves were a thin red line, and the Ark's life support systems were already drawing from non-essential grids. The rogue planet was not a destination. It was a last resort, a single rock in an ocean of nothing where they could, perhaps, anchor their dying ship. Aris fed the coordinates into the helm, a short, brutal burn that would consume the last of their primary fuel and commit them to an unstable orbit around that dark, silent sphere. The engines thrummed to life, a vibration that felt more like a death rattle than a promise of motion. They were not arriving with purpose anymore. They were falling, hoping that the darkness below would prove softer than the endless void around them. What could a dead world possibly offer except a final, frozen resting place? The Ark tilted, its course now irrevocably set for the one place in this star system that was broadcasting a signal. The planet grew from a point of darkness into a vast, mottled disk of deep grays and blacks, its surface scarred by eons of impacts and cosmic cold. There was no atmosphere, no light, no sign of the beacon's source. It was a tombstone, and they were descending toward its inscription. The descent toward the rogue planet was a plunge into absolute night. There was no star to light its surface, no moon to cast a shadow. Only the steady pulse of the prime number beacon gave any indication that this world was anything more than a frozen, airless rock. With their power reserves critically low, Aris had one final card to play. He launched the Ark's last surface probe, a small, rugged scout designed to transmit a few precious minutes of data before its battery failed. It was a final act of faith, a hope that the beacon was more than just a cosmic epitaph. The probe fell toward the darkness, its signal a thin, fragile thread connecting them to the unknown. For a long time, there was only the hiss of static. Then, the first data packets began to arrive. The initial readings seemed to confirm their worst fears, showing a surface temperature near absolute zero and no magnetic field. But then, the atmospheric analysis resolved. Ilara, watching the data stream over his shoulder, was the first to speak, her voice a whisper of disbelief. Aris, look, the atmosphere. It is thin, but it is breathable. The composition was a miracle of improbability, a perfect, life-sustaining blend of oxygen and nitrogen held tight to the planet by some unknown force, a tiny, isolated bubble of air in the vacuum. The visual feed resolved next, a grainy, monochrome image from the probe's landing lights. It did not show a barren wasteland of rock and ice, it showed a forest. The structures were towering and spindly, their branches a deep, volcanic glass black, absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. There were no leaves, no green of any kind. Instead, the entire landscape glowed with a soft, internal bioluminescence. Patches of moss-like growth pulsed with a gentle blue light, while the trunks of the larger trees were etched with swirling patterns of violet and green that shifted and moved like living circuits. The probe's life scanner lit up, reporting a breathtaking density of complex, non-photosynthetic plant life. This world was not dead. It was profoundly, vibrantly alive, but it was a biology built on a foundation they had never seen. It did not feed on sunlight, but on something else, perhaps the planet's own internal geothermal heat, or some exotic form of radiation from the cosmic background. This was not the new Earth they had dreamed of. It was something else entirely, a world that had written its own rules for existence in the deep, cold dark. What kind of life thrives without a sun? And what would it mean for the children of a star-fed world to take root in its shadow? The arc screamed through the thin, clinging atmosphere, a meteor of lost hopes tearing a scar across the starless sky. Aris fought the controls, his hands white-knuckled as the ship bucked and shuddered, its hull groaning under stresses it was never meant to bear. The external cameras showed only a rushing darkness, punctuated by the sudden, terrifying proximity of towering black spires that reached up like skeletal fingers. A final, violent impact threw him against his restraints, the world lurching sideways with a deafening crunch of metal and a shower of sparks. Then, silence. A deep, profound quiet broken only by the hiss of contracting metal and the frantic beating of his own heart. They were down. The main power was dead. Emergency lights casting a dim, crimson glow over the shattered command nexus. Through the fractured viewport, the world outside was an alien dreamscape. A forest of immense, twisting trees, their bark like polished obsidian, rose into a perpetual twilight. The air itself glowed, with carpets of soft blue moss and great, shelf-like fungi pulsing with gentle, rhythmic light, illuminating a fog that coiled around the ark's wounded hull. They had not found the green world of their archives. They had crashed in a cathedral of shadow and silent, living light. The ship was wounded, but they were alive and the air was breathable. Stepping onto this new Earth would not be a triumphant arrival, but a first step into a beautiful, unknown, and deeply strange wilderness. What secrets did this dark forest hold? And could the children of the sun learn to live by its gentle, ghostly glow? The hiss of the inner airlock door sealing behind them was the only familiar sound in a world of alien quiet. Aris checked the seals on his environment suit one last time, the thick fabric feeling impossibly fragile against the unknown. Ilara stood beside him, her breath a soft, rhythmic cloud against her visor. With a final, shared glance, he triggered the outer door. The ramp extended with a low whir, its metal groaning as it met the strange, glowing soil of this new world. The air that washed over his boots was cold and utterly still, carrying no scent, no whisper of wind. The only sound was the persistent hum of their own life support systems and the crunch of their footsteps on the crystalline ground. They were the first humans to walk on an alien planet, and the silence was a presence in itself, a vast, listening attention. The forest around them was a tapestry of living shadows and soft light. Great obsidian trees rose like pillars in a natural cathedral, their branches interlacing high above to form a ceiling that blocked out the empty blackness of space. The ground beneath their feet was cushioned by moss that pulsed with a gentle, blue bioluminescence, each step causing a ripple of light to spread out from their boots. Shelf fungi, larger than they were, clung to the tree trunks, glowing with a warm, orange hue that illuminated the swirling, hypnotic patterns etched into the bark. It was beautiful, but the beauty was alien, unsettling in its perfection. There was no rustle of leaves, no call of an animal, no buzz of an insect. The entire world was a silent, breathing painting. Ilara knelt, her gloved hand hovering over a patch of the blue moss. She did not touch it. "It feels like we are walking through a dream," she whispered over the comms, her voice hushed as if in a library. "Or a memory that is not our own." Aris scanned the area, his instruments showing a stable, breathable atmosphere and no immediate threats. But the data could not measure the profound strangeness, the feeling of being a guest in a home where the host was unseen. They took a few more steps away from the wounded Ark, its broken hull a stark, metallic scar in this organic landscape. With every pace, the weight of their situation grew heavier. They were not just explorers. They were colonists, the vanguard of an entire biosphere sleeping in the ship's frozen vaults. Their every action from this moment forward would set a precedent for the future. How do you build a home in a place that feels like it is already complete without you? And in this world of gentle light and deep silence, what new rules would they have to learn to survive? The path led them deeper into the cathedral of trees, the silence pressing in like a physical weight. It was Ilara who saw it first, her sharp intake of breath a small explosion in the quiet. There, nestled between two colossal, glowing fungi, was a wall. It was not the jagged rock of a natural formation, but a surface of impossibly smooth, polished stone, rising in a perfect, gentle curve that vanished into the dark canopy above. As they moved closer, their boot lights revealed more. A series of low, geometric structures arranged around a central plaza, all carved from the same seamless, obsidian-like material. There were no sharp edges, no seams of mortar, no windows or doors as they understood them. The architecture was fluid, organic, as if the buildings had been grown rather than built, their surfaces etched with the same faint, swirling patterns that pulsed with a soft, internal light, mimicking the forest around them. This was not a natural landscape. They were walking through a city. The scale was humbling, the design speaking of an intelligence that had mastered its environment with an elegance humanity had never achieved. Yet the air of abandonment was absolute. No light shone from within the structures, no artifacts lay scattered in the open plaza, and a fine, undisturbed layer of the glowing moss carpeted every step and ramp. This civilization had not fallen in a rush or a conflict. It had simply departed, leaving its beautiful, empty shell to be slowly embraced by the forest. The prime number beacon had not led them to a living society. It had led them to a memorial, a message in stone waiting in the dark for an audience that might never come. What profound quiet had settled over a people who could build such wonders, and what choice had they made to leave it all behind? The silence was not empty. It was a canvas, and upon it, Aris began to paint the faintest sounds of something else. A soft rustle, like silk brushing against stone, would whisper from the deep violet shadows between the trees, only to cease the moment he turned his head. There were no footprints in the luminous moss besides their own, yet he could not shake the chilling certainty that their path was being observed. It was a pressure against the back of his neck, a primal awareness of unseen attention. Ilara felt it too, her movements becoming more deliberate, her eyes constantly scanning the hypnotic swirls of light on the towering fungi. She stopped once, her hand held up for quiet, her gaze fixed on a dense thicket of stalks that pulsed with a slow, green rhythm. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. A shadow, no larger than a child, seemed to detach itself from the deeper darkness and flow behind a crystalline trunk, its form indistinct and melting back into the pattern of the forest. The alien warning echoed in his mind with a new, visceral clarity. It listens. This was not a metaphor. The world was not merely a passive recording device. It was a living gallery, and they were the exhibit. Every cautious step, every hushed word was being catalogued by a presence that preferred to remain in the wings, studying the newcomers with an inscrutable, patient curiosity. What kind of intelligence expresses itself through observation alone? And what conclusions was it drawing about the creatures who had crashed into its beautiful, silent art? The shifting came not from the shadows, but from the architecture itself. A section of the polished wall seemed to liquefy, its geometric patterns flowing downward to pool on the mossy ground before rising into a new, complex shape. It was a creature of pure crystal, its form a constantly evolving sculpture of interlocking facets and planes that caught and refracted the forest's soft light. It had no face, no eyes, no limbs in any fixed sense, yet its entire being was oriented toward them with an unmistakable focus. It did not advance with aggression, but with the deliberate, patient curiosity of a scholar examining a rare and fascinating text. A low, resonant hum filled the air, a vibration that seemed to emanate from the creature's core and travel through the soles of their boots. It was a sound of pure data, a questioning tone that held no malice, only a profound and silent inquiry. Aris held his breath, his scientific mind racing to categorize something that defied every known biological rule. This was not a carbon-based life form like anything from Earth. This was a being of structured silicon, a living mineral, thinking and moving in ways he could not comprehend. It was the listener. It was the observer they had felt. And now it had decided to show itself. Ilara took a slow, cautious step forward, her hand open and empty at her side. The crystalline entity shifted in response, a cluster of facets on its upper surface swirling into a new, more intricate pattern that seemed to mimic the gesture. It was not communicating with words or gestures they could understand, but with geometry and resonance, a language of pure form. The creature was not guarding a territory or defending a resource. It was conducting a first contact, its entire purpose seeming to be one of study and understanding. In that moment, the silent city around them no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a university, and they were the day's most intriguing lecture. What could humanity, born of sun and soil, possibly teach a being of stone and light? And what, in turn, could this ancient intelligence reveal about the true nature of the cosmos? The crystalline being pulsed with a soft, rhythmic light, its facets shifting in patterns that mirrored the faint, swirling symbols on the city walls. Ilara did not retreat. Instead, she raised her hand, her fingers slowly tracing a sequence in the air. 2 taps against her chest, then 1. A pause. Then 3 taps, then 5. She was counting out the primes, the same numbers that had called them across the void, using the oldest human language of all, the language of the body. The entity stilled, its constant, graceful reformation freezing for a single, breathless moment. Then, a cluster of its facets rearranged, projecting a shimmering, 3-dimensional lattice into the air between them. It was a complex geometric form, but at its heart was the same sequence, the numbers 2, 3, 5, 7, glowing with a more intense light. They had found a common ground. She then made a sweeping gesture toward the silent, empty city around them, her face a mask of open questioning. Who built this? Where are they? The crystal form seemed to contemplate her, the hum from its core deepening. Its facets swirled again, and the projected lattice morphed. A new symbol appeared, a simple, downward-pointing arrow that then faded away. Following this, it projected a sequence of images, not of the city in its glory, but of it being slowly, tenderly overgrown by the forest, the luminous moss creeping up the pristine walls. The final communication was not an image, but a concept conveyed through a single, resonant tone that dropped in pitch, a sound of profound and irrevocable finality. It was a feeling of absence, of departure. And then, a new set of symbols flashed, a sequence the Ark's remaining linguistic database, stripped down as it was, could just barely parse. The translation appeared on Aris' wrist display, the words simple, stark, and devastating. "You are late. The caretakers are gone." The message hung in the glowing air, a verdict on their entire journey. They had not arrived at a new beginning. They had reached a destination long after the farewells had been said, inheriting a beautiful, empty world whose architects had vanished into the dark, leaving behind only a patient, crystalline custodian and a single, haunting question. What does it mean to be the heirs to a legacy when the will has already been read? The crystalline being turned, its form flowing like liquid stone, and glided toward one of the seamless structures. A section of the wall dissolved before it, revealing a ramp that spiraled down into the planet's heart. The air grew warmer, carrying a familiar scent of ozone and preserved things, a haunting echo of the sanctuary Aris had left behind on Earth. They descended into a cavern of breathtaking scale, a mirror to the one he had first discovered, but built with an alien artistry. Here, the databanks were not crystalline arrays, but vast, living trees of woven light, their branches heavy with shimmering, seed-like pods that pulsed with a soft, golden energy. The caretaker led them to a central nexus, and with a resonant hum, a holographic record bloomed in the air. It was a library, a complete genetic archive of the beings who had built this silent city. The records showed elegant, slender creatures of light and subtle motion, their society one of profound connection to their dark, glowing world. They had not died in a cataclysm. The records depicted a slow, graceful departure, a conscious choice to upload their collective consciousness into a higher state of existence, transcending their physical forms entirely. They had left their biological legacy behind, frozen in these luminous seed pods, a gift for any who might come after. Aris stood in the center of this alien sanctuary, a profound chill settling in his soul. He was not looking at a mystery. He was looking at a reflection. This was his mission, completed by another race eons ago. They had faced their own end, and their solution was the same: to entrust the essence of their being to the cold, patient keeping of a machine and a silent world. The caretaker was not just a guardian. It was this world's core, the last steward of a people who had chosen to become starlight. The weight of two civilizations now rested on his shoulders. He had crossed the galaxy to plant a seed, only to find that he was standing in another man's garden, holding an identical, sleeping truth. What do you do when you discover your grand, desperate hope is not unique, but simply part of a repeating, cosmic cycle of preservation and loss? A new schematic bloomed in the air between them, a double helix woven not from one strand but two. The crystal intelligence projected a vision of a forest where obsidian trees grew leaves of deep green, where the glowing moss learned to photosynthesize under a manufactured sun, and where the fauna of two worlds could evolve into a single, resilient tapestry. The proposal was not a conquest, but a courtship. It was a merge. The last steward of this dark world was offering to weave the legacy of Earth directly into its own, creating a new, hybrid ecosystem designed from the roots up to thrive here, in this sunless cathedral. This was not about replacing one world with another. It was about creating a third thing entirely, a child of both Earth and the silent city, stronger and more adaptable than either could ever be alone. Could the fox learn to hunt by bioluminescent light? Could the native flora accept genetic material from an oak tree? The proposal redefined the very idea of survival. It was no longer about finding a new home, but about co-authoring one with an intelligence that saw their arrival not as an intrusion, but as a long-awaited contribution. The future was no longer a destination to be reached. It was a genome to be written together. What would it mean to be human when your legacy is irrevocably entwined with the song of another world? The choice was a chasm opening at his feet. To merge the archives would be to unmake the very thing they had crossed the galaxy to save, transforming the legacy of Earth into a component of something alien and new. Aris stood before the glowing seed pods, the weight of 10 billion years of separate evolution pressing down on him. Was their purpose to preserve a perfect record, a museum piece of a lost world, or was it to ensure that life, in whatever form, found a way to continue? He turned to Ilara, his voice low in the cavernous stillness. If we do this, we are not just gardeners. We are creators of a new kingdom. There will be no going back. No pure strain of fox or fern or human will ever exist again. We are talking about closing the final chapter on Earth and writing a new one in a language we do not yet understand. Ilara's gaze was fixed on the shimmering genetic lattice, her own existence a testament to the complexity of inheritance. "I am not pure," she said softly. "I carry memories that are not mine, echoes of lives I never lived. Is my value less because I am a reconstruction? This world listened and it learned. Now it is offering to learn from us, to weave our story into its own. Is that not a greater form of preservation than a frozen sample in a vault? To keep something in a box is to honor its past. To plant it in new soil is to believe in its future." The debate was no longer about biology, but about the soul of a legacy. Does honoring the past mean replicating it perfectly? Or does it mean allowing its essential spirit the freedom to adapt, to change, and to become something unexpected? Aris thought of the first single-celled organisms venturing from the sea onto land, a terrifying and irreversible leap. This was no different. It was a threshold. The crystal caretaker observed their silent conflict, its gentle hum a neutral soundtrack to a decision that would echo through millennia. Would they choose the safety of a sealed tomb, or the terrifying, beautiful risk of a shared genesis? The dawn in that sunless world was not a rising of light, but a deepening of the forest's own gentle glow. Aris had spent the long, silent hours watching the intricate dance of luminescence on the alien Flora, a symphony of soft blues and vioplets that pulsed with a rhythm older than humanity itself. He thought of Earth's legacy, not as a static monument to be guarded behind glass, but as a river, constantly changing its course on its journey to the sea. Preservation was an act of love, but it was also an act of fear, a desire to hold a moment still forever. True survival was something wilder, more courageous. It was the trust required to let the river find a new path, even if that path led through unfamiliar terrain. With the first shift of the luminous moss cycles, his decision was made. He walked back to the crystal caretaker in the underground sanctuary and gave his authorization. He accepted the merge. The choice felt less like a surrender and more like a long, slow exhale after holding his breath for a lifetime. He was not abandoning his world. He was accepting an invitation to let it live again in a new and beautiful form. What is a seed, if not a promise of change, and what is a legacy, if not a gift meant to be planted in unknown soil? The merge began not with a roar, but with a whisper of light. Deep within the planet's core, the twin archives of Earth and the silent city unfolded, their genetic codes intertwining like the roots of two ancient trees learning to share the same soil. The crystal caretaker provided the framework, a living network of pathways that pulsed with a soft, golden energy, while the newly restored core, its programming now a harmonious blend of human logic and alien pattern recognition, directed the flow. It was no longer just a guardian of human knowledge. but a composer for a new symphony of life. The sterile cryopods aboard the Ark opened their vaults, releasing not fully formed creatures, but the most fundamental building blocks of biology into the planet's waiting, receptive systems. The first changes were subtle. A patch of the luminous blue moss near the crashed Ark began to sprout tiny, translucent leaves that captured the ambient light with a new, green-tinged efficiency. The obsidian bark of the towering trees developed faint, vein-like patterns that mirrored the branching of an oak. It was a gentle negotiation, not a conquest, overseen by two intelligences that understood the delicate art of creation. This was not an invasion of one world by another. It was a careful, deliberate grafting, where every new trait was tested and integrated to strengthen the whole. Could the deep, geothermal warmth of this world sustain a maple tree? Could a fern learn to draw energy from the gentle hum of the crystal formations? The answers began to bloom in real time across the landscape, a living experiment unfolding in the quiet dark. What new kind of dawn was being engineered in this subterranean nursery, and what would its first children look like? The first sprout broke through the soil not as a blade of green, but as a slender tendril of woven light. It unfurled a single leaf that was a tapestry of deep emerald veined with threads of living gold, and from its tip hung a small, pearlescent berry that pulsed with the same gentle rhythm as the forest around it. This was the first child of the merge, a plant that could draw nourishment from both the planet's deep geothermal heart and the spectral memory of a sun it would never know. More followed, a quiet explosion of impossible life. Vines with leaves like stained glass windows climbed the obsidian trees, their fruits glowing with an inner warmth that made them safe to eat. Patches of moss now grew in cushions that released a sweet, nourishing sap when pressed, a food source for any creature that might eventually wake. The air itself began to change, carrying the subtle scent of ozone and something new, the fragrance of alien pollen and the faint, remembered perfume of earthly blossoms. This was not one ecosystem conquering another. It was a conversation, a slow, beautiful negotiation between two worlds that had learned to speak the same biological language. The silent forest was no longer silent. It was humming with the quiet industry of a new kind of growth, a cycle of life that could sustain the children of both darkness and light. What would it mean to taste a fruit that held the essence of two planets within its skin? The first home was a patchwork of two worlds. They scavenged titanium plating from the Ark's damaged hull, its cold, gray metal a stark reminder of the ship that had carried them, and fitted it seamlessly between the living, obsidian walls of a small, abandoned structure. The crystal entities did not build for them, but with them. When Aris struggled to fuse a section of arcing conduit to the alien stone, a being would glide forward, its touch causing the materials to flow together into a single, perfect joint, stronger than any weld. It was a quiet collaboration, a language of shared purpose that needed no words. Their shelter was not large, just a single room with a clear, hardened resin viewport that looked out onto the newly blooming forest. But it was dry, warm, and safe, a tangible promise in a world of soft, glowing shadows. For the first time since leaving Earth, the air did not smell of recycled filters and ozone, but of polished stone and the faint, sweet scent of the hybrid plants just outside their door. This was more than a base camp. It was a hearth, a center point from which a new kind of human story could begin. Ilara placed a small, pulsating fungus on a shelf they had carved together, its gentle light casting a warm pool across the floor. In that quiet glow, the abstract concept of a future finally took root, not as a date to point on a screen, but as four walls and a roof. What does it mean to build a home when your bricks are pieces of your past, and your mortar is the goodwill of an alien mind? The first new creature was a small, six-legged grazer with fur the color of twilight and eyes that shone with their own soft, internal light. It nudged at a patch of the hybrid moss, its movements cautious but sure, a perfect blend of terrestrial biology and alien adaptation. More followed, a quiet bestiary of impossible life waking in the glowing groves. Flying things with iridescent membranes that caught the forest's luminescence soared between the obsidian trees, while burrowers with coats of insulating crystal fur dug into the warm soil near geothermal vents. Each one was a living testament to the merge, a seamless integration that proved more robust and resilient than the original, separate archives could ever have been. They were not refugees in a hostile land. They were natives born of this world's essence and Earth's legacy, perfectly at home in the gentle dark. Watching them, Aris felt the final, cold knot of responsibility in his chest begin to loosen and dissolve. He had not just transported a collection of specimens across the stars. He had midwifed a new genesis. The mission he had accepted in a buried sanctuary on a dying Earth was now fulfilled, not through mere preservation, but through a courageous act of co-creation. He was the last scientist, and his final log entry was not a record of an end, but the silent, thriving world all around him. What greater success could there be than to become obsolete? To see the garden you planted grow so wild and self-sufficient that it no longer needs your hand to guide it. The forest floor was soft and cool beneath their small hands, a carpet of moss that pulsed with a gentle, blue rhythm. Aris sat with his back against the warm trunk of a memory tree, its obsidian bark etched with the swirling patterns of two worlds. Around him sat a circle of children, their faces a beautiful mosaic of human and something else, their eyes reflecting the soft light of the glowing fungi that dotted the clearing. Some had hair as dark as the void, others had skin with the faint, crystalline sheen of the caretakers. These were the first native-born, the true children of the merge. Today, he was not a scientist or a pilot. He was a storyteller. He held up a small, flat slate, a piece of the old Ark's hull he had polished smooth. On it, he had scratched a simple circle with a smaller circle orbiting it. This was the sun, he explained, his voice a low rumble in the quiet air. It was a star, like the ones you see above the canopy on a clear night, but it was our star. It gave us light and warmth from so far away that its journey to us took many minutes. The children listened, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and a quiet, inherent understanding. For them, warmth came from the ground, and light was something the world made itself. The concept of a single, distant fire governing the day was as strange to them as their own bioluminescent forest would have been to a child of Earth. One of the older clones, a girl named Ilara who carried the echo of a musician in her genes, asked about the color of the sky. Was it really blue, like in the dream memories? Aris nodded, a slow smile touching his lips. It was blue, he said, and sometimes when the sun was saying goodbye for the day, it would paint the entire sky in colors you have never seen. Oranges and reds and purples so deep they looked like a bruise on the world. He described the feel of wind, not the still, breathless air of their caverns, but a moving, living force that could whisper through grass or roar through mountain passes. He told them of the sound of ocean waves, a crashing, endless song that had been the first thing his ancestors ever heard. He spoke of these things not with the grief of loss, but with the reverence of a librarian sharing precious, fragile texts. He was not trying to make them mourn a world they would never know. He was ensuring they understood the ingredients that had gone into their own creation. The story of the Ark, of the long journey through the dark and the silent, listening world they had found, was not just a history lesson. It was their origin myth, the foundational tale of how their two-hearted world came to be. The children would inherit a future of impossible beauty, a symphony written in light and stone. But he would make certain they also knew the melody of the old song, the one born of sun and soil and water, that now played softly within the heart of everything they were. What is a legacy, if not a story passed from one hand to the next, ensuring the echo never truly fades? The sky above the forest canopy was bleeding. not with the familiar reds and golds of an earthly sunset, but with colors for which Aris had no name. Great, slow-moving curtains of violet and emerald light shimmered across the impossible blackness, a silent, celestial dance that painted the new, hybrid leaves in otherworldly hues. He stood at the edge of the settlement, the quiet hum of the thriving community a gentle music at his back. This was not the ending he had prepared for, the final, cold log entry in a silent observatory. The death of his world had felt like a period, a full stop at the end of a long and difficult sentence. But here, surrounded by the laughter of children who were part human and part something wonderfully new, he understood that it had only ever been a comma. A pause for breath before the story found a new voice. Humanity had not been erased. It had been translated, its essence woven into the fabric of a different reality, its strengths and memories enriching a legacy that now stretched back to two separate cradles. The will to survive was not about clutching the past with desperate hands. It was about having the courage to let that past become a seed, trusting it to grow into a form you could never have imagined. His journey was over, but the story of life in all its resilient, adaptable glory was continuing on without him. A beautiful, branching narrative written in light and shadow under an alien sky. What is an end, if not the quiet space where a new beginning learns to breathe? The signal began not as a cry, but as a song. It was a complex tapestry of sound woven from the deep, resonant hum of the crystal caretakers and the soaring, hopeful melody of a human symphony. A piece recovered from the Ark's fragmented archives that spoke of dawn and new beginnings. This hybrid anthem, interlaced with the steady, logical pulse of prime numbers, poured from the planet's core, a powerful, focused broadcast aimed at the starry dark. It was not a call for help or a record of loss. It was an introduction, a greeting, an announcement to any who might be listening that in the quiet cradle of a sunless world, a new chapter of life had begun, born from the union of two distinct stories. The message contained no coordinates, no pleas, no maps. It offered only its own beautiful, complicated existence as evidence. It was the sound of a door opening, not closing, an invitation for conversation with the great, silent cosmos. What does a civilization sound like when its first words to the universe are a chorus, not a shout?